To think about enlightenment is to first approach endarkenment. So if you don't go into endarkenment first, you're going to do enlightenment wrong. You're going to do it superficially, and you're going to do it fake. It's not going to be authentic. To be authentically enlightened, whatever that means, it means you get some kind of knowledge, and it takes an effort to get there, and you grow old with grace, and maybe you die with a smile on your face. All those things could be part of enlightenment. But to be enlightened, to even strive for enlightenment, why would we in the first place, if not to impress others? Well, that's the wrong reason, right? If you want to be enlightened for yourself, you don't want to be fooled. You want to live life to its fullest. If that's what you aim for, you got to go into the endarkenment first.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Psychedelic Conversations. Today, here we have two of my favorite guests and my favorite guru, Alex, the philosopher, the psychoanalyst, and then Owen, the artist. Thank you so much for you both to join me. Really a pleasure.
Hello.
Hello there, yeah. And my two best friends in London, I should say, because these days that's Susan and Owen by far.
Except I'm not in London.
You're not in London. You're out, but you're in England. You're in Greater London, right?
I'm a political exile from London.
Right.
Well, tell the audience where you live, actually, and why.
I live out here in Essex, near to Southend, about an hour outside of London. And I live here because over the last year, I just got completely fed up with London. I think it's going downhill incredibly fast, an incredibly fast rate. And as a young guy, and as Susan mentioned, as an artist, there's very little for me there. There's very little youth culture. It's very hard to get anything off the ground. Even if you are doing stuff, there's so much competition. There's so much everything happening, but also people seem to be so cynical. The poet 100 years ago, William Butler Yeats, said, "London is where all intellectual traditions go to die." He nailed that 100 years ago, and I think he got it more or less right. So now I've come to Essex for greener pastures, where everything feels a bit fresher, younger, a bit more nouveau riche, but a bit easier. And there's more and more people moving out here, actually, from the city.
I got my own theory on that one, because I see the same thing happening in New York, in Paris. The major cities, like the really big ones, people are moving out simply because once you realize you live in a city of over 10 million people and everybody is still stuck to the smartphone all day long, you might as well live totally isolated from them, since the smartphone has killed all distance. So the whole point of packing 10 million people together has disappeared. I'm in Stockholm. There's only about 2 to 3 million people in the greater Stockholm area. Even we here in my monastery, we are planning now to buy our own property outside of the city, 2 hours away from here, to be able to shuttle and go there into isolation as much as we possibly can, because simply we only want to be in the city when the city really is to our favor. But there's no point in staying here any longer when we can be totally connected with everybody in the world online anyway.
So that leaves me with, I'm the only one in central sort of London. Well, not central, but in London, in this dense city. Seems to be working for me. So I'm not going to say anything about moving away, staying right here, grounded, foot on the floor. But I love London. I grew up here. And I think I hear you, Owen, about the competition and how hard it is here. So I feel you. So that being said, I want to just kind of transition us into today's topic, which is before we jumped on this call, guys, we were just kind of back and forth exchanging some ideas. And one of the things that the purpose of this gathering, of course, is the idea of Endarkenment, which came from Alex. And it was a very intriguing concept to me.
No, it did not. It came from you, Susan. You got it own when you actually philosophically meant something. But I should just say that we have two other friends, Joachim Lummer and Raven Connolly, who we both work with. I work very tightly with Joachim, Owen worked tightly with Raven, and you worked with all of us, Susan. And I should just say that Joachim was the one who emphasized in my previous conversation with you here on the Psychedelics podcast Susan, that you were the one who took me to that place called Endarkenment, and we started developing the concept. And why I wanted to have this conversation today is because Owen, Reed Raven are working on a huge art project they call the Dark Renaissance. So you got the four letters dark right there. Mm-hmm. And I'm really thrilled to see if we can make a comparative study. We call it the Endarkenment Club. We already have that mail thread already centered around Susan and her concept, her idea, not mine. So I just want to emphasize that, Susan. No, you should own that. You invented it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the credit, and I really appreciate that. So you always seem to have this power of forging things into the, I guess, consciousness and in our spaces. So I appreciate that. The Endarkenment actually came from the Celtic, actually in the UK. I mean, who would have thought, right? The UK lands. One of my favorite concept of this country knows how to do dark, right? So they know how to. It's like in one of my medicine journeys, what came to me was that the UK was the land of, symbolically, and maybe Alex, I don't know what you're going to think of this. It'd be very interesting to hear your thoughts. The message, the insight that came was the UK as a land, the archetypal representation was the undertakers. I know it's dark, undertakers. And the reason is because on the surface, it's very polished, structured, controlled. And underneath it, there is a lot of death, rebirth. And this country knows how to do it because of the people that walked this land many, many hundreds of years ago. I think that has a lot to do with, it's kind of like remained in the air, in the environment, the energy, the vibration, and also in the bones of people. Like the moment you start living in the UK, before you know it, you're kind of like sold to this thing. Like there is an energetic openness and willingness to go down that path here. So I feel like some of my work formulated and became richer in the UK land just because of the soil, because of the they can do this really well. And in this country, like this is the heart of the world. And this is where the death, rebirth, and the endarkenment can happen. I don't know if you're feeling that, Alex.
Oh, sure, I do. I mean, obviously, it's the Celtic tradition we're talking about. And we could just go to popular culture right now and say Game of Thrones. And it's a UK phenomenon that went worldwide. And thanks to the UK, by the way, you also managed to export the Viking concept to the rest of the world. I can't travel anywhere any longer without somebody shouting Viking after me. Although it wasn't a Swedish series, it was the Brits again that did it, right? So you managed to do these things over and over again. So the storytelling certainly is part of that. But I was just going to ask Owen about that too, because to me, there are two different ways of looking at it coming from outside, looking at the UK and the British and Irish traditions. And that's, there's the Celtic pagan aspect of it, clearly. And the further you get from Rome, the more pagan your European culture becomes. Both Sweden and England are way more pagan than Italy, just as an example. The other aspect is that 19th century romanticism. I mean, I love the 19th century because all the great European philosophers were 19th century thinkers, but Hegel, Nietzsche, and all the other guys. But when it comes to the 19th century, there was also this strong streak of romanticism. And romanticism was a German and French phenomenon too, certainly German one, but it was really German and British. That's the way I see it. So is it the 19th century sort of capacity to think dark, or is it the Celtic pagan tradition we're talking about here? What do you think, Owen?
Well, I think it's both. I think a lot of those romantics looked to you could say the pagan or the shamanic traditions of these islands even. And that was because the UK, I think we have a weird political history in modernity because we had our revolution, if you like, early. We had it in the 17th century. And it wasn't a complete bourgeois revolution like they had in France in 1789 that was then copied across Germany and Italy and lots of the other small states and kingdoms of Western Europe and Eastern Europe throughout the 19th century. And the Brits, in fact, looked at all of that, at that Enlightenment, and went, ooh, we don't really buy that fully. we have our own tradition of thinking liberty and parliamentarianism that goes over, and the Americans take it up. And that also accounts for the American skepticism of European style big states and socialism and all of that. But the Brits also had this, it came from through the arts. There was this big naturalist movement in painting, and then there was the Romantic poets. And there was this real sense, and Alexander, you're right, there was the same thing in Germany, I think, of going, that fucking French with their fucking specific idea. We don't want that. We've got more of a dream consciousness, you could say. We have more of a storytelling capacity in our spirit, and that is not being reflected in whatever is going on politically over there. And we do romanticize our ideas of aristocracy and of social hierarchy a little bit. I think this idea of just a completely kind of flat, equal rights of man never really made sense to the British consciousness.
That's exactly why I exported upstairs, downstairs around the world. It's called Downton Abbey, etc. So not hiding class differences is something intensely British, and therefore also Marxism never took off in Britain, right?
Yep.
I mean, Hitler and Stalin certainly weren't British to begin with, but you're absolutely right. When it comes to a different mindset from continental Europe compared to Britain, there was clearly one where pragmatism took root in the British, in the British and Irish world, and of course, a lot of the thinkers that you often return to your work over, like Oscar Wilde and Aleister Crowley and all that, they came out of the British Irish traditions, and they're not seen as philosophers, which I think is dead wrong. Although I think the greatest thinker the British Isles ever produced was Darwin. He's one of my favorite philosophers ever. We still haven't really understood dialectics and Hegel. We still haven't really understood evolution coming from Darwin. We really still haven't really understood sexuality coming out of Freud. But Darwin is a massive thinker, and he was certainly very British. And you wouldn't think evolution unless you were pragmatic first, would you?
Hmm.
So you've been weak on dictators. You don't have a lot of dictators to show for it, right? Do you? That's the problem. So you had your bloody monarchs as anybody had, but you had that pragmatic attitude where the acceptance of hierarchy and the acceptance of aristocracy and the acceptance of a certain class society was actually a result of that culture. And in pop culture where it thrived, that meant you were working class and proud of it, which was totally alien to Germans and French. It was typically British to be working class and proud of it.
Well, in fact, I think the mess that the Britain is in right now is that the middle class have started piping up and trying to force their culture on everybody. And you've got more of the classic working class and a lot of the classic upper class going, what the fuck is this about?
But didn't you import the middle class from Europe? Isn't that why it's alien to British culture?
Well, we import... It
is the welfare state. It is bourgeois. It's nervous.
I think we made a lot of them.
It's the kind of people that Susan and I work with all the time because they come to psychedelics to escape out of their misery, the middle class misery they got. Because always, I came from South Africa to Sweden when I was a kid. You know my story. And then I arrived in Scandinavia. I had a Swedish mother, so I had two cultures. But what was striking when I came to Scandinavia was that I was taught by my father about the class system of Scandinavia. I realized how weak it was compared to anything I've seen before. But I still learned that the upper class were comfortable. And I still learned the working class were comfortable, and the middle class were all the guys who were nervous. And Sweden is nothing but the middle class. Sweden is London. It's 10 million of Londoners. They're all middle class, with all the nervous as a middle class and the conformity of a middle class too. It's like living in a country where the conservatives didn't exist in everybody's labor. That's exactly what Sweden is like. So I would say that isn't the middle class precisely what is alien to British culture? And that's exactly what's problematic today.
I think so. And I think a lot of it came from the unexpected consequence of Margaret Thatcher in the 80s, is that basically these people who came from working class families and who had strong kind of old school labor commitments, who then got rich from the Thatcher years and then hit the late 90s and were in this strange place where basically they wanted to be socialists, but actually they were enjoying the cheap, easy money from deregulated finance. And they've never resolved that in themselves. And woke was the perfect project for them to commit to, because it means you get to keep your nice, big, fancy bureaucratic job in a quango or a big bloated corporation and still feel like you're down there with the people, the ordinary people in the provinces.
And then the ordinary people came back and did Brexit.
Yeah. And they have...
And that's the most famous hashtag ever, isn't it? Besides Game of Thrones. But Brexit is the ultimate British hashtag. But it really is. I mean, it's striking that it happened in Britain. It didn't happen in Ireland. Ireland is already too middle class. And Ireland didn't have the class system that Britain had originally. And when I worked in London for 25 years in the music industry, I would always connect with Irish. I would connect with the Stones. I didn't get the British because they had such a sophisticated class system that they brought with them to the lunch meetings. They were always impossible to deal with. And certainly I couldn't have them close. I mean, there's a reason why the two of you are my best friends ever in London. I can trust you because you've seen through it. But the nervousness of that was something I couldn't really handle. But the class system and the orientation within the class system and the penalism and the secret clubs you'd had to go to London to have business meetings, all of those sort of very rigid things full of social coding was very difficult for me as a Scandinavian to get through. So I just appointed Irish and Australian people living in London as my ambassadors, and they took care of it because they disliked it as much as I did. I disliked it because I didn't get it. They disliked it, period. But they were my best friends. And since then, I started hanging out with Irish and Australian people in London and let them do my business deals. It's kind of interesting, right?
Mm.
But there's something to it. There's an attraction to it, of course, like anything that has resistance to it, an attraction to it. So why don't we just start there? We're talking about Britain here. Susan living in London, you living outside London, and me sitting here in Sweden, dealing with you guys is that, and when it comes to, for example, why is such a large part of the psychedelic renaissance in Europe right now happening in Britain?
Mm.
Isn't that exactly the sort of question that we're all three concerned with? And I would like to have your take on that. Maybe start with Susan. Why is it happening in the UK?
Mm-hmm.
Where is the receptivity?
Yeah.
Why is it welcome? But at the same time, where's the need or the urge to go into that realm in the British?
Yeah, for sure. I was just reflecting as you guys talked about the class system and the way the UK works. Interestingly, when I started going into the education, psychedelic education, being in the UK, it was very difficult to connect with the UK people who are already somewhat established in the UK, the psychedelic front lines. And it was really difficult. It's almost like there's a gatekeeping happening, I believe, some gatekeeping. And then, of course, finally, I went and I discovered in some events, I discovered some really genuine people. And what they told me that UK always embraced psychedelics. Just because, yeah, always. We actually, I spoke to, his name is Robert Dickens, he's a really cool guy. He researches psychedelics, and he said, he's on my show as well. He said, if anything, UK has embraced psychedelics far more greater levels than the US ever can. Just because it's always been in underground, because of the way the system works, that people somehow kept it very secret, almost like everybody knew that it existed. But now, of course, we have the science emerging, so we now have more studies, papers are published. So now UK is positioning as the hub in the movement, right? So there is this, if anything, probably the largest studies that have come out of UK. There are some serious people that are leading some serious research on psychedelics, which is great. Why? I'm guessing, I believe in contrast. Alex, as you know, like the Endarkenment, you said in your email, there is no enlightenment without the Endarkenment. I believe there is a contrast in the UK. There's a heaviness. There's a contrast that invites psychedelics currently, and it's received well. I think it's going to be, going forward, UK probably going to advance at such a fast pace just because of the level of contrast. It's kind of the leverage. These are my thoughts for now, but maybe, subject to revision.
Yeah, what would we always take on that? Why is Britain more receptive? I mean, the only other country in Europe, well, Spain, certainly, and Netherlands, Spain, because it's welcoming to anything, because it's the tourist mecca of Europe. You can do anything you like in Spain. And Netherlands, because they always presume that they've got a drug addiction problem, and the way to treat it is to treat it with psychedelics, which is a great take. It seems to work as well. But I mean, still, it's nothing compared to Britain. I mean, Britain is the center of psychedelic research and psychedelic discourse in Europe. And I wonder if that ties into those very British cultural traditions like Wilde and Crowley and the other guys. Fisher. We could talk about Fisher.
Yeah, totally. Fisher's very much in that lineage. I mean, I think this is.
We should say who the Fisher is we're talking about here. So you
Mark Fisher. So
yeah,
Mark Fisher.
He died a few years ago. He killed himself, actually, but he was a very young, certainly philosopher, a very young, smart British thinker of the early 21st century.
Part of the cybernetic culture research unit, who, I mean, the story there is interesting because even that can fit into what we're talking about of the UK, is that basically in the 90s, this group of weirdos took over the Warwick University philosophy department for a few years, and they were going deep into Deleuze and Bateson and the latest cybernetic thinking. They were also blowing their brains out with amphetamines and jungle music, going into Aleister Crowley and other esoteric practices. I think at one point they bought a house that Aleister Crowley had lived in. So it was like an academic department, but intensely rock and roll or rave driven in the 90s. And it went on for several years. And I think even today, I mean, Raven and I work a lot with the papers and the books that were written at that time. Nick Land probably being the other massive figure from the CCRU. And I think Land and Fisher in particular, they're these gems that will take decades, if not centuries, to unpack, really. And I think to zoom out from that slightly, I think maybe what the UK has is that we've got this tradition of liberty that's slightly different to mainland Europe, that also the US took up, but we're also less committed evangelicals and Puritans than the US are. So where the US have their libertarian tradition, but it also sits within quite a, it's kind of cute, their Christianity, but a bit of a joke. And the fact that now, like J.D. Vance, they're all becoming Catholics, it's like, fuck off. I was just in Naples the other day. That's Catholic. Brazil is Catholic. North Americans saying they're Catholic, they're just Puritan Protestants, blah, blah, blah. Nobody's buying it. But I think that is the thing about Britain and the UK.
I think I got to put that in. That one-liner is magic. He says that J.D. Vance is he's a full Catholic. He pretends to be Catholic, but he really is nothing but a Baptist pastor. Like
nobody buys it.
No. I just want to put that out there. J.D. Vance, yeah. He's a fake Catholic through and through, yeah.
Yeah. So that's it. I think perhaps that's because we don't have this strong sense of morality against drugs. Actually, we have had a very vibrant youth popular culture that fully embraced drug taking. I mean, the Beatles were some of the first to go over and basically do what Crowley had done in the 20s for his tiny little group of friends, go to India and bring back all these yogas and drug practices. The Beatles did the same thing, but then blasted it through radios and through records. And
but you kicked out the Puritans, didn't you? I mean, you kicked them out, obviously, to New England, the Mayflower. But I mean, my background is from the colonies. So there were Puritans in South Africa, certainly, and they came from Britain. And they were clearly kicked out by the Brits. So you basically kicked them out and kept some kind of pragmatic party mode or something like that. Wasn't that London at its best as well?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. And another take on this that I want to time with our conversation today that I found interesting about Britain already in the 1990s. I mean, if we're going to look back at the first 30 years of the 21st century in the future, we're going to say the only two genuinely new things that happened were the internet and ketamine. New. I mean, mushrooms aren't new. Sorry, but they're not. The discovery of mushrooms might be new, but mushrooms aren't new. But, mass-produced Chinese ketamine and the internet coming out of America were the two major innovations of the early 21st century. Anything else, has been around forever. But we can't say that those two things have been around forever. Those two experiences are new. And what I found fascinating with the Warwick guys, and the reason why I hanged out with them in London when I was there 25 years ago, was not because I was a philosopher, because I wasn't a philosopher yet. I just started writing. I was in the music industry. And it was easier to hang out with the Warwick guys because of that, like guys like Nick Land, simply because I was a rock star or a music producer, because they did hang out with a lot more of those people than with those philosophers they talked about. They didn't hang out with the Derridas of France or anything like that at all. They had their own worlds themselves, and they were very integrated with popular culture, like advanced popular culture, which is very British. And what I found interesting was already in the 90s, they saw the connection between cybernetics and psychedelics. That might sound weird, but I don't think it's weird at all. I think all three of us are exactly in that cross point. We know we live in the cybernetic age when cybernetics takes over the world. It's called the internet. It's called AI now. We don't care. It's just data processing all of it, and we're terrified of the police state being around the corner. What we're going to try to do is try to use the data wiser and smarter than that. Let's see where we end up. But I'd say already in the 90s in London, you have that conversation between, and there's something weird about cybernetics and psychedelics, but they somehow seem to gel together, these two fields. And people might think that's American, but it isn't. It's really British. Wouldn't you agree?
Agreed. This is great. So can we sort of move into the Endarkenment, and maybe our listeners are wanting to hear, what is it all about? Why are we talking about Endarkenment in the first place? Do you want to share a little bit, Alex, and then we can, Owen, and then...
Yeah, sure. And then we can talk about the Dark Renaissance, and then we can try to develop where they're connected, because they do tie into these themes we just brought to the table, certainly. When I say you got to go into Endarkenment first before you become enlightenment, it's because I have that very Persian Zoroastrian attitude with me, that I'm skeptical of people who display how spiritual they are. And you and I have talked about it before, Susan, how allergic we are to people who think spirituality is a pose. It's a dress you put on. It's an image. Like it's the Russian tourist who arrives in Goa and you sell him the hippie kit, when he arrives at the airport, so he can pretend that he's spiritual and walk around. Because Russians do that anyway, and they don't think it's anything but a tourist thing to do anyway. So they're more honest than anybody else who tries to be spiritual by dressing into spirituality. So this sort of fake spirituality that comes from displaying it in public. I mean, it's the old Kalandaria Sufi or Bektashi Sufi. We talk Turkish traditions, where Susan comes from. So if you talk the Bektashi Kalandaria Sufi traditions, which always said that you're closer to God in the brothel you can ever be in the mosque. It was the skepticism towards taking spirituality as something you would display in public to show how spiritual you were, by not having to work, for example. Therefore, you were so spiritual you didn't have to work, right? So that skepticism is something that I took with me when I started studying Zoroastrianism, and I discovered, of course, the psychedelic work. It was just obvious right away, because in the psychedelic room, you can't be cool. The first thing that disappears, in a room of 20 people who drink ayahuasca is, no, drop the coolness right away. You're not going to be cool in this room. It's not going to happen. You're going to be at your very, very worst self. But thankfully, the other 19 people will be that too. So don't worry. But that undressing is rather what spirituality starts with. And that's why I love the concept when you presented it, Susan. You said that, well, for example, if you drink ayahuasca, you don't become psychotic. You're not really there yet. You haven't really done the experience properly. You're not there yet. And then we came up with the term that you started using, Endarkenment. And I said, Endarkenment is perfect, because then we could just say that to think about enlightenment is to first approach Endarkenment. So if you don't go into Endarkenment first, you're going to do enlightenment wrong. You're going to do it superficially, and you're going to do it fake. It's not going to be authentic. To be authentically enlightened, whatever that means, it means you get some kind of knowledge, and it takes an effort to get there, and you grow old with grace, and maybe you die with a smile on your face. All those things could be part of enlightenment. But to be enlightened, to even strive for enlightenment, why would we in the first place, if not to impress others? Well, that's the wrong reason, right? If you want to be enlightened for yourself, you don't want to be fooled. You want to live life to its fullest. If that's what you aim for, you got to go into the Endarkenment first. And I think, Owen, I mean, when we talked about the Dark Renaissance, the term was dropped, I think, first time by Edwin Bywater together with Raymond Connolly, just like it was me and Susan. Maybe he started using the term Endarkenment the first time. But why don't you explain how Dark Renaissance, how you took to it and became the Dark Renaissance artist that you are?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's great because it even ties into where we just were. So actually, Nick Land, the philosopher we just mentioned, wrote these essays several years ago called The Dark Enlightenment. And they were a series of commentaries on another popular underground internet thinker, Curtis Yarvin. And long, but what the ethos can be summed up, Land had a nice one-liner, which was that where the progressive Enlightenment sees political ideals, the Dark Enlightenment sees appetites. And what he's going towards there, obviously, is if the political, or the progressive Enlightenment rather, is interested in these Rousseauian ideals of like the will of the people expressed, and it's love and light, and we can think ourselves rationally and all hold hands together. Land is going for a much more Hobbesian view, which is that, okay, maybe we can have an enlightenment. Maybe we don't need some kind of medieval, feudal, religious, top-down structure supporting some aristocracy. However, maybe the reason we have political structures is there's more of a pessimism, or you could say a naturalism to it, that we're animals, really, and there are drives, there are violent drives, there are sexual drives, and these are the things that form a lot of the basic matter of day-to-day life, and the things that, if they're not contained very nicely, can explode outwards. And so we'd in the IDW, in our communities, Alexander and Andrew Sweeney and Thomas Hamilrick had been doing a lot of work on sutra and tantra, sort of like spiritual practices of renunciation and spiritual practices of transformation, of sexuality, of violence, of the difficult stuff of subjectivity. And Raven and I sort of grew up for several years in the climate of listening to those podcasts. I mean, that was when I first met Alexander. I was walking around London listening to these horribly produced but amazing ideas, just going, who the fuck are these three guys? And then I got to meet you guys, and it was great. And when Edwin suggested the word Dark Renaissance, I think it was a spin-off on the Dark Enlightenment, which remained essentially a political philosophy, where we were going, what's the cultural movement? What's the artistic movement? What's even the spiritual movement that's the counterpart to saying let's be less politically idealistic and more interested in the complex problem of the human. And since then, I think what we're working with now in Dark Renaissance, we move more towards improv theater and theater with masks and rituals and ceremonies, and again, psychedelics. But I think for example, in September, we were playing around with theater with ketamine, and rather doing like deep, intense dosages for personal, sort of like a personal journey, you do smaller dosages, and then you can set people free in a space and allow them to play out little plays with masks and costumes and all sorts of interactions. And that's what we're working with. It's sort of like what can you let out of the human subconscious in a group setting?
I think what came out of those conversations talked about earlier in the IDW was that we had these moralists like Douglas Rushkoff, Nicholas Carr these days, it's Yuval Harari, who moralize against the arrival of the internet and it's going to destroy the world or whatever. You know, it's just a new technology. And like any new technology, the only proper response to it is neutrality. Yeah, of course it has winners, it has losers. Of course the world will be different. It will not be the same world any longer. It's already radically changed over the last 30 years. It's probably going to change even more the next 30 years. And there's tons of madness out there. Hello, Donald Trump, you know. But the thing was that none of that shocked us. It's just like, yeah, and so what? And that whole approach of the so what was like, yeah, and then we got the Gothic tradition, we got Batman, you know, we got the dark in culture, in popular culture, had it for the last 40 years. It's not about returning to that at all. It's more like accepting that that's a more normal state of things. You take a cup of coffee on Monday morning and you write a Batman script because it reflects the world a lot better than, you know, any sort of uplifting kind of message you're supposed to give people, which is just too rubbish to be true. We're not credible to anybody any longer. So it was this attitude that, yeah, we can handle that. And if we can handle that, it's just like with psychedelics. Once you discover that we have this certain substance and have a certain dosage, and we discover, yeah, we can handle that. That's exactly when you stop doing the experimentation, but you get over the healing and you can move on to the inspiration part. Oh, now we're friends with the molecule. Let's see if we can do it for inspiration. So I think that attitude was so clearly there in the IDW early on. And that's why the whole idea of the Dark Renaissance caught on. Because we were just asking ourselves the question, so what if there is a renaissance of the digital age? What if it is a new Dark Ages? What if a new Dark Ages isn't a bad idea at all? Because the alternative, which is a global police state, is horrible. And we do not want that. We don't want Orwell to speak British traditions. No. So if you don't want that, then maybe New Dark Ages isn't that bad at all. Just like history is being rewritten now from the perspective of maybe the huge empires weren't really the victors of history, and maybe the people who really did well were the ones who managed to escape those empires and get out of the slavery in them and rather be independent and free so they can think for themselves. And maybe that is what the Dark Ages is all about. And maybe the return of the Dark Ages isn't such a bad idea. Let's go into that. Let's accept that. Let's explore that. And that's why I think in all its simplicity, that term dark renaissance caught on.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to that a little bit more, studying, for example, the Italian Renaissance is so inspiring because the sort of surface history level book is, okay, you've got your Donatellos and your Michelangelos and blah, blah, blah. But really, you dig a bit deep beneath the surface, you've got these banking families who are not aristocrats. They're nouveau riche as fuck. And they've just made a shit ton of money from loaning these new trade routes coming up. They're incredibly rich. They're in a lot of tension with the Pope down in Rome because he thinks he can control everything. So they're sort of doing the banking for the Pope, but then the Pope puts his nephew in a position of power. And then they go, do you know what? We're just going to make our city-states beautiful and stunning. So we're going to go down into the brothels and pick this gay artist, Donatello. Like, Donatello is a raging faggot. And my favorite story about Donatello is that Mr. Medici had hired him to make a statue for one of his clients. And the client tried to haggle Donatello down on the price of it. So Donatello said, fuck you, and threw it off a roof and smashed it on the street below. Then walked out, and the Medici, I'm sorry. I'll see if I can get him to do it again. These were divas. They were drama queens. They were a lot like rock stars. It's not these like perfect, spiritual, platonic artists that gets projected onto. It was a rough and ready age, and people were getting assassinated. And I think that's where, studying that age, I look at Donald Trump and I go, oh yeah, well, this makes sense. Similarly, I spent a lot of time studying the Roman Empire. There's always these fucking crazy emperors who are lunatics. Nero burning down the city and playing the violin as it's playing. It's unfortunately, this is what humans are. This is often what politics is. It's not some Rousseauan dream of the perfect state looking after everybody. It's not a nice communist paradise. If anything, it's just people playing out power dramas.
Isn't that what happened after 1945? After 1945, it was like only Jews are allowed to talk. And we got Theodore Adorno, and we got the Frankfurt School, and we had Derrida, and we had Levinas in France, right? And it makes sense, right? They had to deal with the fact that Hitler and Stalin was the ultimate nightmare of human history. So all of modernity had done all the way up to this absolute total disaster and mass murder. And the concentration camp was just there. And it was sort of like, okay, we aren't better than this. And then having to deal with that, of course, you ask the Jews, can you please help us deal with that? I think that led all the way up to Theodor Adorno publishing Negative Dialectics in 1965. I know that book is constantly referred to in the W circles. But the problem was that even that response to the Enlightenment was still within the Enlightenment. Derrida's attempt is still to have an enlightened approach to all the dark instead of embracing the dark, going into the dark, because Derrida again became one of those, nothing wrong with him as a philosopher, he became the fake spirituality that takes a distance from the evil and becomes a moralist anyway. And at the end of the day, when you get to the 90s, and you get to London, you get to the drugs, and the drugs mixing up with the cybernetics, suddenly there's just, yeah, we get it. We've read the guys, we read the Jewish chronicles, we've studied the anti-enlightenment now, but the anti-enlightenment now from Adorno to Derrida is also enlightenment. It was still there. And the only guys they found were these two absolute madmen in France, Deleuze and Guattari, this Italian anarchist who was a psychiatrist. They were doing tons of drugs, by the way. You should remind Susan that Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault, their best friends, were doing like drugs every day. Foucault famously did drugs every day, right? So Deleuze, Guattari, and Foucault were hanging out in France in the 1970s, and they didn't take that whole, Paris Spring very seriously. It was just like, yeah, it's all about getting laid. Basically, that was their attitude. And out of that came these amazing books like Thousand Plateaus that came in the early 1980s that inspired the next generation. But I still think what Nick Land and the other guys sort of figured out was that, yeah, but this is still too continental and too held back. There's not enough drugs in it.
Mm-hmm.
There's still not enough drugs in it.
Yeah, so that kind of helps us to transition into the psychedelics. I guess it goes hand in hand, the messiness, the darkness, the endarkenment. I mean, psychedelics are for me is the portal that, you go into. You said earlier, we need to go into the darkness. We need to go into the chaos. I think it's already happening. I think what I'm thinking is that we just haven't caught up. That is already here. The mess, the chaos, and the endarkment is already here. It's always here. I think it's also cyclical. Like, sometimes I speak to people where, it's happening again. The shift is coming again. I'm thinking, well, I think it's always there. It's always happening. It's that you just kind of opened yourself up to it right now, right? Because imagine Rumi hundreds of years ago sitting around with his friends saying, shift is happening. We're enlightening, right? Awakening or whatever it is. I find that really intriguing. But of course, there is some of us here that really get the darkness and the mess and the chaos as the origin of the existential unfolding. And that's where I am also.
Can I just drop a little bomb here then for you guys? Here's the word that then makes me allergic. That's the word shadow work. Because shadow work to me is just like, I'm going to work with integrating my shadow, but still keep everything as it is. I would put, it's a proposal. Let's see what you guys think. Let's see Susan first and then Owen. What do you say if endarkenment is something radically different from shadow work? Let's see what your take on that would be.
So endarkenment is really dismantling of the familiar. There is no pick and choose. There is no keeping something and then, deliberately letting go of something. It's all of it. There is nothing is left in this process. So shadow work feels like a toddler trying to hold on to their toys while trying to do grown-up work, right? So it feels like that.
Oh, and what's your take on that?
Well, I've always been skeptical of the integration crowd.
Yeah, because you never did shadow work art, did you?
No, exactly. I mean, any artist who's worth his salt will tell you that when I'm creating, I don't know where the fuck this is coming from, but it's certainly not coming from me. And so this idea that there's something inside to be discovered and integrated, I mean, sure, there's self-understanding to cultivate, but there's so much, I think we're vessels for things that we can barely understand. And of course, working with psychedelics is a great way to just open and see and go, holy shit, there's a lot more happening than I was aware of. And to sustain this fantasy that I can somehow become the master of that and hold that all together. No, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. And if anything, to go back to what you were saying, Alexander, your Zoroastrian skepticism. Yes, the people who walk around, I'm so integrated, I'm so whole, I've figured everything out. They're the worst.
Catholics. Actually, just point out this. I agree with you totally, but it's the word integration here. So when Susan and I use the word integration, we do use it for the psychedelic process.
Sure.
So you have the intention, you have the ceremony, you have the integration. And it's very important to go through all three, and the integration is the most important. That's not how we use the word here when you and I are talking hero. But when we talk about the integration crowd, we're talking about the people who, as soon as anything is dropped in the room, they'll jump to integrating it into a worldview where everything makes sense instantly, right? The Ken Wilber crowd, as you call them in the world of spirituality.
Yeah.
And I agree with you totally, because they don't go deep into psychedelics. They take the drug when it's the in thing to do. They go to that retreat center to do whatever you're supposed to do, but they do it just to keep the facade and then go back to their everyday reality and keep on living exactly what they did. And to me today, I'd say that historically speaking, I think the archetype of this integrative person, the person jumping to the integration idea-wise, like cultural jumping integration at all times, that person is the beginning of dogma. So those are the very people who, through the neuroticism, jump onto dogmatics. And they are the ones who therefore create the organized religions, where you have to believe in a certain way, you have to confess to a certain belief, and if you don't do that, you're basically exterminated, you're killed or thrown out or whatever. And therefore, that leads to Puritanism, and that, of course, leads to the resistance to psychedelics. Psychedelics is, for a good reason, the enemy of this crowd, because they like to keep everybody sober in the room so they can control it. And that neurotic disposition to control the room is what drags them pulls them together. And what you discover when you do philosophy with them is that they don't dare to think freely. When you do art with them, they don't dare to think freely, so they can't be creative. What they want to do is they want to jump to that fairy tale end to everything you do. Like they want to jump to, yeah, but it has to be good news to people. You have to tell people good news. And it's just like, yeah, that's storytelling. You could do that to kids, like Susan just said. It becomes infantile. You talk about shadow work. You have to jump to that integrated. It has to be a good ending. So if I'm doing the drug, you have to guarantee me beforehand I'm going to arrive at a good ending, and just go. Not when you work with me. Now we work with Susan or Alexander. It's not going to happen. We're not going to guarantee you anything. We just guarantee you that it's our judgment that you're ready to take, go through the experience. But that's all we guarantee. We're not guaranteeing any end whatsoever. This is totally out of our control. And that freaks them out because they need to integrate the world for themselves. So we should maybe have another word for it. They call themselves integrativists, right? Integrationists.
Integralists, maybe.
Integrationalists. Yeah, integrationalists. Yeah. So we call them integrationalists in that case, because the integration itself is important to go to the next step and then go to the next step, obviously. So I think we just clarify that.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, Aaron. No, I was just going to add on to Alex's integration concept. Yes, it's very important in psychedelic work, but the way and I'm sure Alex understands it, is that it's not about digging and unpacking and then looking for something to integrate into us. It's about being with what just happened, being with what's dismantled in front of your eyes, and staying long enough looking at it and being with it. For me, that's kind of the process that kind of helps us get on to the next. Because once we understand what's just dismantled, it's almost like not even integration, it's like unintegration. I don't know, because you are already a contained, boxed person, rigid and very contained, integrated, right, to the society, to the environment, to the belief systems. Now you've taken a huge dose of psychedelics, and that's being broken down and dismantled. Okay, let's sit with that for a while before we do anything with it. So that's kind of my approach to integration.
It's like you say integration when you do the intention at the beginning, but then when you're through with the whole process, you look at them, you go, now you opened up.
That's right.
So you're not really integrated at all. You've learned to live with your lack of integration. Your unintegration is actually what you learn to live with. And this is exactly what these integrationalists hate. Yeah. They want the integration to literally be integration of their entire worldview, and they want to have that worldview to then bang it on your head and beat you with it. And that's exactly why these people are the very precursors of dogmatists, and they're the ones who eventually construct organized religion to control people according to their very neurotic mindset.
This is where, so for example, Peter Gray, who's another of these contemporary British writers and occultists, and his thing is mixing Aleister Crowley with witchcraft traditions. He writes beautifully of shadows, and he just makes the point that a room without shadows is horrible. It's industrial fucking hospital lighting. Like wherever you go in nature, wherever the sun is, the sun casts a shadow, and the play of shadows is what gives spaces their particular beauty, their particular charm. And so this idea of integrating the shadow, which is where we started, as opposed to this conversation about integrating a psychedelic experience, this vision of banishing the shadows is really that thing that's quite, you say, violently destructive to the sources of our creativity. And so another artist I spend a lot of time with, Werner Herzog, he says similar things. And here's where he's skeptical and critical of psychoanalysis, where he's saying that basically the same thing, a house has its dark corners and its rooms and its shadows, and that's part of what's interesting, the creepy attic upstairs, the creepy basement that you go down into 2 times a year. You don't want that to be part of the drawing room. You don't want that to be where you spend all of your time. Let that be, and then your place has character. Similarly with a personality, this drive to unearth and uncover and see and therefore hold everything in this neuroticism is the word for it. That is ultimately the death of creativity. It's the death of any sparks. And I think it's a drive that is, again, wherever it shows up, it kills culture.
So then to keep the mystery alive, to keep the unknown alive. And from our earlier offline conversations, Owen, I love what you said about becoming other in order to stepping into the determinateness and insecurity. So I really love that, and that speaks to the psychedelic experiences directly, to be honest, in my understanding.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, look, I'm also a deep student of the ancient poet Ovid, who wrote the Metamorphoses. I think that's probably one of the greatest works of art ever, and it's just this giant meditation on transformation and change, but there's no progressive line to it. And maybe this is to tap back into what we're talking about, the progressive enlightenment. I think it's that progressive thinking that assumes that history is always getting better. And also you happen to be right at the center of history always getting better, gets taken and applied to the self as, I'm on a positive journey and I'm always getting better. And every day I feel more like myself. And every day I feel more free, blah, 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 blah. As opposed to this much more, you could call it a shamanic method of becoming other, embracing, you could say, the animal within, or these god forms within, and going through a yogic transformation, which is precisely what the psychedelics can open up. And then even at the more, I guess, the extreme stages where senses of linear time begins to break down. And here's where we get into the cybernetics conversation again. And one of the things with cybernetics is that time is not as straightforward as we think it is. There are attractors in the future sort of pulling us forwards to different potentials at the same time. Maybe Alexander, you can say more about this because you work on this much more clearly than I do.
Well, it's the event is vanity, but the event is still there, because otherwise everything will be a repetition of the same. But the point with process and event, with the whole book title and the whole book, was that process and event must always be seen together as a couple. It's like human has to include both man and woman. It's one of those dialectical deadlocks which is absolute. So the thing, though, is that event is still only temporary, like something happened, something transformative happened. We're still being pulled back in, and one day we die. So process wins. And that's okay. It's like woman wins. Man doesn't win, but man, because he doesn't reproduce, has to protest and try to invent something different to reproduction. And therefore, man does all kinds of silly things and try to create utopias or whatever. And they usually fall down. At least he leaves a few skyscrapers behind. And then female architects I saw did come by and they create big pussies for aliens to see or something instead. But, the event is vain. The event eventually folds into and falls back into the process. And it took all the way for me and Jarl Söderqvist to go to the point we admit in process and event that we are Zoroastrian out of protest, because Zoroastrianism is the one religion that embraced the event. So Zoroastrianism introduced linear time in history as complementary to cyclical time. The thing with the Persians is they didn't separate linear time from cyclical time. The death of cyclical time was the attempt by Christianity and Islam and the dogmatists we talked about. The neurotics couldn't live with both cyclical and linear time. They couldn't live both with the feminine and the masculine. So they had to kill the feminine, the cyclical, to live only with linear time. And that was the big mistake of Christianity and Islam. And what happened was that eventually Islam had to repeat the same traditions every year. The same time Muhammad got pissed off between Medina and Mecca, they have to repeat that. And every time Christ is born in Bethlehem and every time Christ is on the cross in Jerusalem, that has to be repeated every Easter. So you still go back into a mad process of an event that still is process. And it's ridiculous. My critique of Christianity and Islam, you both know that my next big project is to steal Sufism from the Muslims because they haven't appreciated it enough. It deserves to be its own world entirely, free from Islam. But the reason why I do that is that Sufism clearly included both cyclical time and linear time. It's the only Western religious tradition that included both cyclical time and linear time in parallel. Because linear time is only the attempt to try to escape out of the cyclical, but you be pulled back into the cyclical. So John and I wrote, we are Zoroastrian by choice, but we have to admit that the only true religion is Jainism. Because Jainism is the ultimate female religion. And what's funny, I've looked at the data. We look at Western converts to Zoroastrianism and Jainism. They're both about as new to Western culture. They came after Buddhism, so they're sort of getting a reputation now. But it turns out the majority of converts to Zoroastrianism are men, and the majority of people in the West, Americans and Europeans, who convert to Jainism are women. Why? Because Jainism is just atheism, but cyclical. Like everything is these huge eons of time for like hundreds of thousands of years, a bit like the universe, right? Eons of time that repeats themselves in long cycles, and that's it. That's why Indian minimalism is Jainism. If you think India is Baroque and over the top and all that, you go to India and walk into a Jain temple, there's nothing there. No statues, no faces, no famous people, no idols, nothing. You just sit and contemplate and meditate into pure nothingness and cyclicality. That's what it is.
Do you know, I had a question just came up. Both of you maybe. So how do we restore the principles of the feminine and the masculine?
I think that's happening naturally anyway, because I think a return to paganism is what's happening in our culture. And I think Owen and I are seeing the early stages of that already, because there's a huge interest in what paganism could be today. And then the first option is that, why don't we jump back to it? And then we just go, well, we don't believe Odin and Thor exist, do we? So it was all about something else. So I call it reformed paganism. My choice to convert to Zoroastrianism and now going to Sufism is simply because I want to make that journey with the very people who have already done it. Although I'm not totally convinced that with psychedelics and other tools to our disposal, we can now take Western culture into the same spin. And the big issues of Western culture, like for example, why we don't breed any longer, or why we're not willing to defend our countries or defend our cultures any longer with our own lives. All those sort of signs of decadence we have are because there's such a huge lack in secular society. And we cannot go back to Christianity. And I think eventually Arabs will discover they cannot go back to Islam, at least not the Islam they had. And certainly not the dogmatic versions of these religions. They're dead ends. So something radical must happen. I think psychedelic culture is open to that. And a lot of the people, like 9 out of 10 people, who at least I've guided to psychedelics, go on to a spiritual journey where they start thinking about the society they live in. Now, what kind of spirituality would be possible or even required to wake up that kind of society? This is what we talk about Renaissance or Dark Renaissance. So I'd say that for me is why I'm so deeply interested in this, and why I think reformed paganism is absolutely necessary for the West. I don't say what you think, Owen, because we cracked the joke of J.D. Vance pretending to be Catholic before. That just shows how dead Christianity is.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think one of the interesting things, right, is that the people who are able to unplug from, say, the big city 9-to-5 lifestyle, all of a sudden begin to discover that is a big and in a sense quite effective machine just for suppressing and ignoring things like the cycles of nature. And if you're a woman, particularly the cycles of your own body. And I'm around more and more women, for example, who are starting to pay attention to their menstrual cycles and realizing that, oh my God, I'm a different person every day of the month. I didn't really realize that when I was inside of a big machine, or I had all of these neurotic symptoms that were coming up. But now I can just be in this loop, and it's much nicer. And I'm noticing with my projects as well, that on a bigger scale, the seasons, actually, there is a kind of quality of work that happens in the seasons. Right now we're in spring, and spring is a great time for just getting stuff started and new connections and new friendships and new things. It's happening. And again, I think I have an openness to that because I'm not wedded to this very, very strict, just constant. It's almost like Alexander, you were saying about the process, the artificial process of Christianity and of Islam gets replicated in the sort of like the big machinic life of being in a big social organization. I don't want to write that off completely. It's very effective. I mean, that's kind of how militaries run. It's just by saying, fuck off cycles of nature. We're just applying ourselves fully to our own process and we're going to make it work. But people are tuning into these things. There's more of an interest in returning to the body and returning to the land. And that's all tied in with this paganism that Alexander is talking about. That what are the symbols and the stories that reflect this land? So yeah, I think you're right, it's happening. And I think to me, it's pointing to those little things, people who experience themselves as being secular atheists go, well, if you're a woman, you have a menstrual cycle. And if you're a man, you still live in the seasons.
I'd add to that that women are taking the lead here already. So for example, when I do men's work here in Scandinavia, and we're very happy to found a map of about 20 different spiritual centers around Europe, we can do men's work. We discovered that women already have 500 of those. Women have literally already changed religion. In this sense, Camille Paglia doesn't get the attention she deserves, but who cares when the underground is totally Paglian today? Women are returning to female spirituality, and they take the lead. And they don't buy into Christianity and Islam. I take another example coming from the Islamic world. we now have between 6 and 7 million practicing Zoroastrians in Iran. And our friends talking from inside Iran all the time. Officially, they're 300,000, but the reality is 6 to 7 million. The vast majority of practicing Zoroastrians in Iran today are women who've left Islam. Why? They're sick of the mullahs, right? Women in Kurdistan leave Islam. Why? They're sick of Islamic State. They're sick of what Islam became. And it wasn't for women. And it wasn't, you know what? It's not only that it wasn't for women welcoming. They don't care about that. Secular society offer that. No, there was no female spirituality to be found there. So women are going back into their bodies. And that's when it turns out that, for example, Buddhism is very compatible with that. The first version of that was sort of commercialized, very superficial version. We called it New Age. It came out of America. But right now, it's not New Age retreat centers being built around Europe. It's Buddhist retreat centers being built around Europe, and women are taking the lead. So for me doing men's work, I just said, look, the girls just walked ahead of us. We need to catch up. Where's your masculine spirituality?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you experienced that in Britain where you work, Susan, but this is clearly the case in continental Europe.
Well, I work with multinational and it's global, my work. So I also work with a lot of women. And something that we need to probably mention here as a universal theme in women don't believe in a God outside of them. This is across the board. This is in all religions, actually. I meet from very different cultured women from all parts of the world. When they find a safe space, the first thing they express, they don't believe in such religion or a God in the external. So the religion of the women is to reconnect to the center, because the God resides within for women. I think they've been very sort of suppressed to say this out loud, and for whatever reason, I mean, of course, we know the reason. If you look at the history, how they were treated for expressing such truth that comes from within. So that's what I'm saying. And I think psychedelic consciousness is going to usher us through this process of restoring the principles of the feminine and the masculine. But first, I think we need to clear out the cobwebs, which then comes the endarkenment processes. We definitely need to clear out the cobwebs before we can get there, I believe.
I totally agree with you. So I think that's exactly why we're having these conversations and where we work in parallel at the moment. So, so one thing, for example, we can just take this out for this conversation. I'm not going to use the term shadow work any longer. I'm not going to tolerate in my work. I'm going to go for endarkenment, straight for endarkenment. And I'm going to explain exactly why I prefer that term. Because I think shadow work is too superficial. And then explain it. It's just like you allow yourself to be separated that way. And I think that whole idea of God being separate from me is really the masculine split. Men are split between the logos and the pathos. And if they're only comfortable in their logos, they will then declare pathos to be God. And if they're only comfortable in pathos, they declare logos to be God. And they don't understand that women don't have that separation. So perfect example of that is that all women tell me that sexuality and spirituality are one and the same thing for women. I think for some good reasons, we do separate them among men. But once men start talking about sex and violence as two twins, they discover that sex and violence are related to them, and they can no longer twine them the way they used to. And suddenly it starts to make a lot more sense to actually look at them together. Two sides of the same coin. So there's something similar going on there as well. But let's dig deeper into that and see if we can take it. I agree. I think paganism is the proper word. I think a reformed version of it that makes sense to us is necessary. And I want to throw one thing into the conversation with the two of you that I've been waiting to ask you tonight. And that's, I did a podcast with a Swedish military officer the other week. And he's a fighter pilot. And he's forget Tom Cruise. This is the real thing. This is the guy we shoot Tom Cruise to smithereens. This is the real thing. So his name is Max Willman, and we're having this conversation. It's being published this week. And then I said to Max, what if reproduction, women's willingness to reproduce, which is now in a crisis in all the Western culture, birth rates are falling everywhere. What if that and men's willingness to defend their country are totally intertwined and they're two sides of the same coin? Then nobody's told us that. So we're going to have a demographic crisis It's going to look worse than climate and environment. It's going to look worse than Russia, Ukraine. It's going to look worse than Donald Trump. It's going to look worse than anything. There's going to be the big, big political issue of the 2030s, with different sides fighting each other, whatever. But it's going to be the fight for the different solutions, demographics. And we're going to have these hysterical solutions, like when people go to, TV series and says that we should lock up women like with Puritan Christianity, and then they will finally be forced to breed or whatever, We'll have all these weird things coming up in the 2030s as if they were serious. I'm totally convinced it's going to happen. And I'm preparing women that this is going to happen. There's going to be a lot of men screaming and shouting, you should be forced to breed. So you better be prepared for that, sisters, and therefore prepare the arguments and that debate to say that, listen, I'm as a woman, I'm allowed to demand this and this and this before I breed. You got to prepare society in such a way that I want to breed. And here's the trick. At the same time, we're discovering that Europe is now spending trillions of dollars on defending itself when America is leaving Europe. And it's like a shock. It's been happening over a few months. Donald Trump started the whole thing, and it was bound to happen sooner or later. We've had the warning signs for like the last 30 years, and finally it just happens. But the fact that it happens is that the people discover that we're going to spend tons and tons of money on building defenses, and then you get the numbers coming in that only 1 out of 10 women in Denmark want to defend their country, and only 2 out of 10 men want to defend their country. And it just looks like the ultimate decadence, right? Well, what do you think, Owen, about that? Do you think these are two sides of the same coin? Like, as a man, I don't want to protect and provide for my woman unless she wants to breed. But on the other hand, she does not want to reproduce herself. She doesn't want to breed and have children unless she's being fully protected and provided for.
Yeah, well, I think there's this huge squeamishness, basically, about the pathic aspects of life. I mean, it's not new to say that what the battlefield is for man, birth is for woman. That's a little piece of folk knowledge that's gone around forever. So it doesn't surprise me that you're pointing to some kind of link between them. I mean, I think we really are so squeamish and afraid of especially expressions of male pathos. I mean, even now in the UK, I'm curious what you think about this, Suna, but we've got this whole moral panic at the moment because Netflix have just done this new fucking propaganda film called Adolescence about young men getting radicalized by stuff on the internet and becoming murderers. It's like, okay, it was heavy metal music that turns you into a murderer. Then it was video games that turns you into a murderer. Now it's the manosphere that turns you into a murderer. And it's like, okay, there's a few fucking guys listening to Andrew Tate and incels, but really guys are just online because they go, this is where I can talk to other men about real things and get advice about the gym and martial arts and how to actually flirt with women and pick up women. But it's turned again into this squeamish, fucking middle class purity, fucking cowardice storm. But I'm absolutely sure that the same people are getting terrified by this show are the same that don't want to go near having children. It's like, I think if you don't allow the men to have their pathos, then why would the women go to their pathos? Alexander, go on.
Just want to add a detail. You have to remember, you just mentioned heavy metal, you just mentioned video games, etc. That means if the incel starts murdering, he will get laid. That's the Endarkenment position. Isn't that the Endarkenment position, the whole phenomenon of adolescence of the TV series? You just wanted to mention that. So the middle class will never get away with their fantasy. They won't. But of course, they're pretending to be terrified. At the same time, they don't breed.
I mean, look, everyone knows that, I mean, talking 19th century, the soldier is a super sexy archetype with his uniform, and he comes in with his whiskers and maybe he's a little bit drunk and he walks in and the women love him. It's also this weird sign of 20th century decadence, I think, how much we look down on soldiers. And that's only really in the last 30 to 40, 50 years, I think. Even after World War II, of course, they were heroes. But now there's a real cynicism about calling a man a hero. Or he probably murdered someone. Yes, because he was defending the fucking country. But we don't believe in our society or our civilization's right to exist. And so any war is immediately framed as being an act of aggression, right? It's this pacifism that just assumes. I think Thomas Hammerich really good on this. It's just talking about containers, right? There's this assumption that we live in this world of human rights and everybody has human rights and everybody's nice. And anything that looks a bit nasty is denying somebody their human rights. And that's horrible. Whereas actually, no, human rights exist within a container. And you can protect the boundaries of the container. And within that, you can try and have the rule of law, and you can try and have all sorts of equality and recognition and blah, 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 blah. But the whole point of that is that there's an outside of it. filled with fucking lunatics and barbarians. I mean, something we're getting a bit away from the whole reproduction question, but I think we really need to rehabilitate the idea of barbarian as well, which is an ancient word, but of those who do not accept what civilization is.
Well, they're called shamans in our work. We are the shamans, aren't we? I would just like to add to that. There's another one-liner. There's another one-liner in here, which is more on the feminine side, which is, oh my God, she decided to breed and have a kid and wasted her life. Isn't that the same thing as saying, oh, he's a soldier, then he's a murderer? Aren't those two positions the ultimate forms of decadence? Where the soldier really, at least formally, tries to defend the country and protect and provide for us, and the hunter provides and the soldier protects, and you got those male archetypes, and then your female archetype is the mother. This hatred, like Camille Paglia says, where feminism failed was that it didn't go all the way to celebrating the mother, the ultimate female archetype. I mean, this is what's deranged. So we should not even cynically try to think of the kind of spirituality we're promoting. We shouldn't cynically try to make it breeding. We shouldn't cynically try to be the answers as that we have families with 3 kids on average. We shouldn't even do that. We should just assume in our work that we will encourage men and women to raise families and have kids. Otherwise, there's something fundamentally wrong with the spiritual work we're doing, because it just come naturally that women want to become mothers and men want to become fathers. And if that doesn't naturally happen, we're wrong. Isn't that the test of us being we should be? And this is where, I mean, endarkenment is such a deep, deep concept and profound. The endarkenment is precisely where sexual attraction starts. Enlightened people don't fuck. They certainly don't fuck, and therefore they don't breed. And darkened people do. And the consequence of something, you don't know what you did it, suddenly you're pregnant, baby's born, you got to change your life completely. You realize nature has taken over you because you just bred and had a kid. But at the end of the day, that's the most natural thing ever. It should, of course, be celebrated. And any culture that doesn't celebrate the mother and the father is self-hatred culture, period. Fundamentally.
Well, amazing. I think, shall we begin to close the conversation? Are we good to bring all the threads together? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I'm happy with that. And we should have Raven with us the next time. It was wonderful just to have this starting conversation and lay out the framework for Endarkenment and Dark Renaissance. There's so much more to dig into here.
I believe so. I feel like we laid out a really good foundation. And so much is said, and I'm sure we can do many episodes and each thread, and have Raven on the next one for sure. Thank you so much for your time, both of you. It's been a pleasure to have you, and I'm hoping our listeners will find this conversation very, very insightful. And before we say goodbye, let's kind of say our last closing notes, starting with Alex, maybe.
I can start, yeah. I just want to be personal here to jump to something entirely different, but I think it ties in. I came back from Denmark a few weeks ago where I was honored to lead an ayahuasca ritual with only men. And it had such a profound impact on me that we actually decided to cancel a lot of men's work that we're doing this spring, because simply we had to rethink it. There was so much depth to the whole experience that we had to understand what that depth was first before we proceeded to take the next step. We're doing a huge project together. Owen is involved in it in Björnbach outside Stockholm in September, first weekend of September. So you can contact us if you want to get involved. But it's going to be a leadership event for men's work in Europe. And of course, after that profound experience of February, all the guys who were there said, this has to be done again. I have to tell my friends that they can do it. This has to be pursued. But it was amazing. And this just, I just want to say this, Susan, here as my finishing line today, because I just want to say it because that's how important your work is. It just became very obvious to me how important this work is. And now we're finally taking those rituals. Like I said, the women started with taking those rituals into men's work as well. And they really work. They really do the work profoundly.
Amazing.
So I
Thank
want to
you
finish
so
there
much.
for this conversation. We can go back to that later, but I'm still integrating that experience, even though I led it. I'm still integrating that experience for myself to see where that leads eventually. But I'm looking forward to future conversations on that topic.
Thank you so much, Owen.
Mhm. I mentioned earlier that we did a ketamine ceremony back in September, and I think in terms of my own musical career, that was the most interesting 2 hours we've ever done. And Salvatore, who I play with in Microcosmos, who's a Neapolitan classical guitarist and composer, he had very similar experience. I think you get so used to performing in conservatoires or to clubs and bars, to actually have a room filled with 15 people who blindfolded, just with, and it was only a small dose, but fully listening, combined with the technology we have now where you can have padded synthesizers that literally just make a space vibrate slowly, and then acoustic instruments on top. It was stunning. It was beautiful. And I want to do a lot more of that, and most of my team agree. It's doing these ceremonial shows, or these ritual show is not even the right word. Doing rituals, doing ceremonies, and bringing art into these ceremonies and rituals. So there's no reason why the music in a ceremony should be limited to a gong, for example, or a simple drum. You can have a gong, you can have a drum, but you can also have you can have so much more. And I think this is such an interesting space to work and develop, and that's what we're really going into.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Well, we'll be adding all of the information in the show notes for our listeners to get in touch with Alex or Owen. So thank you so much. So I'm looking forward to our next session, and speak very soon. Thank you for your time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. Please add into the comments, share with us any insights, any questions. Feel free. Don't be shy. I'll see you on the next one. Thank you so much. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Owen.
Big love.
Ciao.
Bye for now.